On a rain-slicked night in Brightmoor, where the river swallows the city lights and the wealthy hide their sins behind tinted glass, a 27-year-old widow named Della Whitlock stood beneath the flickering sign of a pet shop, soaked to the bone, clutching a black Neapolitan Mastiff puppy against her chest like it was the last warm thing left in her world. Her coat was thin, her hands were shaking, and her voice barely rose above the rain when she whispered to the woman behind the counter, "Whatever you can give me for him is enough. I just need to keep my house." Nobody in that shop understood why a grieving woman would sell the final gift her dead husband ever placed in her arms. Nobody knew she was only days away from losing the home he'd worked himself to death to provide. And nobody noticed the man standing in the shadows behind her, Rowan Vance, 36, the most feared name in the city, a man who owned half the docks, moved fortunes through banks that smiled at him, and hadn't felt anything close to mercy in years. He'd buried his own wife long ago, and with her, he'd buried whatever was left of his heart. He'd walked into that shop for business, not for tears, but something about the way her shoulders trembled, the way she kissed that puppy's head and whispered an apology for what she was about to do, made the coldest man in Brightmoor go completely still. He didn't move to help her. He simply watched, and then his eyes settled on something small, ordinary, the kind of detail anyone else would have walked right past. But Rowan Vance wasn't anyone else. He'd survived this long because he noticed what others missed, and what he saw in that moment didn't add up. A grieving widow, a dying husband's last gift, a house slipping through her fingers. None of it should have meant a thing to a man like him, yet he couldn't look away, because some quiet instinct, the same instinct that had kept him alive in a world built on betrayal, was telling him that this trembling woman and the puppy in her arms were standing at the center of something far bigger than either of them. Understood. Something he was about to be pulled into. Something that would force the hardest man in Brightmoor to choose, for the first time in years, between the empire he'd built and the woman he never saw coming. If a story about loyalty, buried secrets, and the kind of love that can soften even the hardest heart is what you're here for, then do me a favor before we go any further. Hit that like button, share this with someone who believes second chances are real, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's go back to that rainy night outside the pet shop, and meet the broken woman who was about to change a ruthless man's life forever. Many months before that rainy night, Della Whitlock's life had already become a long chain of days that seemed to have no end. Every morning, she woke while the sky was still pitch black, slipped into her faded uniform, and drove her old car to the little cafe on the corner of Maple Street, where she poured coffee and carried plates for 8 straight hours, with a weary smile she always forced onto her face for the customers. The scattered tips that dropped into the glass jar were never enough, but she still counted every coin as though those small pieces of change might somehow save something. When her shift at the cafe ended, she went home, stole a few hurried hours of sleep, then changed into another set of clothes and drove to the cluster of tall office buildings downtown, where she mopped floors, emptied trash cans, and vacuumed rooms that belonged to people she'd never once met. They went home to their families, while she stayed behind beneath the cold glow of fluorescent lights, pushing her cleaning cart through silent hallways until nearly midnight. 2 jobs, 16 hours a day, and still the money she earned kept disappearing before she could even breathe. On the dining table in her small house lay stacks of envelopes she'd no longer had the courage to open right away. White envelopes printed with bold red warnings, piled up notices for the electric bill, the water bill, the car insurance, and worst of all, the final letter from Northridge Bank that had arrived only a few days earlier. She had stood in the middle of the kitchen for a long time when she opened it, her hand trembling so badly the paper almost slipped to the floor, because inside was the cold announcement that she had exactly 7 days left before the foreclosure process on her house would officially begin. 7 days. That was all the time left for everything that remained of her life. That house wasn't only 4 walls. It was the one place in the world that still held the breath of Eli, the husband who had left her 3 months earlier when he was only 31 years old, taken so suddenly that she still hadn't learned how to believe he would never walk through that doorway again. The only friend who remained beside her was June Aldridge, a 29-year-old nurse who lived a few blocks away, the woman who still stopped by after long hospital shifts, carrying a container of leftovers from the cafeteria, and a kindness Della didn't know how to repay. The night before, June had sat with her at the table buried beneath debt collection letters, quietly holding her friend's calloused hand and asking whether there was any way she could manage, whether there was anyone she could borrow from, whether there was anything left that could still be sold. Della only shook her head, because she had already sold almost everything. The wedding ring had gone months ago, then the television, Eli's old guitar, even the small, ordinary things that had once meant something to her. June looked around the hollow room and sighed, saying she wished she had more to give, that a nurse's salary didn't leave her with much either, and that she hated this world with everything in her for being able to push a good person like Della to such a place. Della gave her a faint smile and said she'd be all right, a sentence she had repeated so many times she had almost begun to believe it, even though deep inside, she knew she was slowly sinking. She had done everything a person could do. She had cut back until she skipped meals just to save money, had begged the bank for more time, had called assistance numbers only to hear mechanical voices read policy terms back to her, and still, the door kept closing inch by inch. That night, after June left, Della sat alone in the darkness, listening to the rain begin to tap against the roof, and realized there was only one thing left in this world that she had never dared to imagine parting with, the one thing that still carried warmth inside that cold house, and that perhaps the time had come for her to face the most heartbreaking thing she would ever have to do. The only thing she had left was curled up at her feet, a small creature with jet-black fur and dark brown eyes that followed her every movement, a Neapolitan Mastiff puppy Eli had brought home only a few weeks before the day he was gone. Della could still remember that afternoon with perfect clarity, when the door swung open and Eli walked in wearing the radiant smile she had loved more than anything in the world, his hands cradling a tiny puppy so small it nearly disappeared in his arms, trembling and whining softly. He set it down on the kitchen floor, then looked at her with the expression of a boy who had just done something foolish but endearing, and said he knew they didn't have money to spare, that he should have asked her first, but he just couldn't leave it behind. Della had pretended to scold him for a moment, then knelt down on the floor, and the instant the little puppy clumsily crawled into her lap, every word of reproach melted away. They named him Bruno, the name Eli chose because he said a dog from a breed this large would one day need a name sturdy enough to carry. The weeks that followed became the last stretch of happiness she'd ever know without realizing it was the last. Evenings when the three of them lay together on the worn rug in front of the fireplace, Eli stroking Bruno's head and laughing when the puppy gently nipped at his fingers, while Della rested her head on her husband's shoulder and believed that life, however hard it was, still held so many days ahead. One night, when Bruno was fast asleep in his basket, Eli turned to her, his voice suddenly lower in a way that felt strangely serious, and said he wanted her to promise that she'd always keep this dog by her side. Della had laughed and asked why he was talking so solemnly about a puppy, and Eli had only squeezed her hand tighter and said that dogs of this breed were loyal clear to the marrow, that no matter what happened, Bruno would watch over her, would stay with her when he couldn't. At the time, she had thought it was only a tender, passing remark from a husband who was given to dreaming. She couldn't have known that not long afterward, those words would become the last thing he left behind, a promise she would have to carry in his place for the rest of her life. After Eli was gone, Bruno became the only thread connecting her to the life she had once known. Every time she looked into his brown eyes, she saw the shadow of her husband's smile, heard the echo of his deep, gentle voice in a house that had now fallen so silent it was hard to breathe inside it. Bruno grew astonishingly fast. Though still a puppy, his frame was already thickening, showing hints of the massive guardian Eli had predicted. Yet every night he still burrowed his head into her lap, as though he understood exactly how completely she was breaking apart. That was why the thought of having to sell him cut into Della's heart more painfully than any debt lying on that dining table, because selling Bruno wouldn't be any different from selling the last living piece of Eli's memory. Selling the promise she had sworn to protect, selling the only pair of eyes left in this world that still looked at her as though she were worthy of being loved. But as she sat there in the darkness, with 7 short days counting down and a stack of debt notices leaving no way out, she understood that keeping the house Eli had poured his whole life into building was also a way of keeping him, and if she had to trade one part of him to save what remained, then perhaps that was the cruel price fate was forcing her to pay. She bent down, pressed her face into Bruno's warm fur, and let the tears fall in a room where no one was left to hear them. About 12 miles from Della's small house, on the other side of the city where glass towers rose into the night like upright blades, there was a man whose name everyone in Brightmoor knew, though very few dared to speak it unless they had to. Rowan Vance owned an office on the top floor of a building that looked straight out over the river, a vast room paved in dark stone, with panes of glass stretching from floor to ceiling. where he often stood alone for hours, silently watching cargo ships dock beneath the sickly yellow lights. Most of those docks belonged to him, as did the transport warehouses, the prime parcels of land being redeveloped, and a network of financial companies whose paperwork was always so clean that no tax authority could find a single crack, even though everyone in the underworld understood that the money flowing through them had never truly been clean. He had built all of it from nothing, step by step, with a cold mind and an unforgiving will, and to keep it, he had learned how to cut every soft thing out of himself. That night, inside a sealed room in the basement of a riverside warehouse, people saw just how cold that man could be. A man Rowan had once trusted to manage one of his routes was dragged before him, drenched in sweat, stammering through an explanation about the missing money in the books. Rowan didn't shout. He didn't slam his fist on the table. He only sat there in the leather chair, slowly turning a glass of liquor in his hand, letting the silence stretch until it became hard to breathe, before he finally asked the man in an even voice what he hated most in this world. When the man couldn't answer, Rowan answered for him and said it was lying, and a single slight nod from him was enough for the two men standing behind the prisoner to drag him out of the room at once, leaving the sound of begging to fade behind the steel door. He didn't blink, didn't show even the faintest tremor across his face, because to Rowan Vance, mercy was a luxury no man in his position was ever allowed to have. But behind that cruelty was a loneliness so deep that even he had long ago stopped giving it a name. Years earlier, he had been a different man. He had once had a real home, once had a wife carrying his child, and then all of it had been torn from him in a single night by people who wanted to strike at him, leaving inside him a hollow place that no power or money could ever fill. From that day on, he lived like a shadow, moving through his own empire, trusting no one, drawing close to no one, sleeping in empty rooms and waking inside the silence. Lately, that silence had been disturbed by something else, a stubborn instinct that something was rotting from inside his organization. Numbers that didn't match, money that should have arrived whole, but had been drained away with subtle precision, transactions arranged so skillfully that only someone who understood the machinery could have created them. Rowan had quietly ordered his people to review every money route for weeks, telling no one, not even those closest to him, because his survival instincts warned him that whoever stood behind this wasn't an outsider. It was someone very near, someone who knew how he thought, someone patient enough to bleed the organization drop by drop without being discovered. The further he followed the numbers, the more they seemed to lead toward a darkness he didn't want to believe in, and that very suspicion made him more watchful than ever, pushing him out of his familiar office so he could personally trace the smallest clues through the city's hidden corners. That was exactly why, on that fateful rainy night, the most powerful man in Brightmoor found himself in a place as ordinary as a small pet shop on the edge of the old neighborhood, where fate was already waiting to crash into his life in a way even he couldn't have foreseen. The woman standing behind the counter of the pet shop was named Marlowe Pratt, a 62-year-old woman who had been tied to this little store for almost her entire life, a woman whose gentle eyes had seen enough human sorrow pass through that glass door to last more than one lifetime. When Della whispered with a trembling voice that she was willing to take any amount of money if it meant letting Bruno go, Mrs. Marlowe didn't answer right away. She only looked at the young woman clutching the dog as though she were holding her own life in her arms, and inside her rose a familiar ache of pity, one she had known too well but had never allowed to harden into indifference. She gently asked Della whether she was sure, asked again and again as though trying to give her one last chance to step back, because she understood all too clearly that no one held an animal that way if she truly wanted to sell it. Della lowered her head, pressing her lips tight to hold back a sob, and nodded, though her hand was still clenched so tightly in Bruno's black fur that her knuckles had gone pale. At that exact choking moment, from behind her, a low, even voice sounded, cutting through the steady hiss of the rain and the ticking of the clock on the wall, a voice that made both Mrs. Marlowe and Della go still. The man in the dark coat stepped out from the shadowed corner where he had been standing quietly all along, and without any preamble, he said he would buy the dog. Della spun around, her eyes filled with both confusion and suspicion, as she faced this tall stranger, with a face that showed no expression at all, and before she could manage a word, he had drawn a thick stack of cash from inside his coat and placed it on the wooden counter, an amount so large that Mrs. Marlowe drew in a sharp, quiet breath. It was many times more than anyone could have paid for a puppy, enough for Della to cover the debt hanging over her house, so much that for one dazed instant she thought she must have heard him wrong. But what truly left her stunned wasn't the money. It was what the man did next. He pushed the stack of cash toward her, then said in a voice so calm it sent a chill through the room that she should take it and keep the dog. Della stood frozen, unable to understand what she had just heard. She stammered and asked what he meant by that. What kind of person paid to buy something and then didn't take what he had bought, and whether he was mocking her misery. The man didn't explain. He didn't offer a single word to reveal why he was doing it. He only looked at her with eyes so deep they seemed to be weighing something only he understood. Then pulled a small black business card from his coat pocket. On it were only a name and a phone number. No title, no address. He placed the card on top of the money and said that if she needed real help, not the patchwork kind of help she had been trying to scrape together, then she should call that number. Della stared at the card as though she were staring at a snake. Every instinct in her screamed that nothing in this world was ever given for free. That a man who appeared out of the darkness with a stack of cash and a vague offer must surely want something from her. She stepped back, held Bruno tighter, and asked him plainly who he was and what he wanted from her. But the man had already turned away, walking toward the door with the unhurried stride of someone who had never needed to rush for anyone, and he stopped at the threshold for only 1 second to say she didn't owe him anything. Then he vanished into the night rain as suddenly as he had appeared. Mrs. Marlowe stood behind the counter, her hands still trembling, staring at the money and the black card, lying there like two objects that didn't belong to their world, then whispered to Della that she had lived in this city long enough to recognize who had just left, and that whatever his reason might be, a man like that never did anything without a purpose. Della looked down at Bruno as he lifted his head and licked her chin, then looked back at the cold black business card, and for the first time in many months, amid the vague fear rising inside her, a fragile and deeply uncertain spark of hope began to stir in her heart. Throughout the days after that rainy night, the image of the woman clutching the black dog inside the pet shop kept returning to Rowan's mind, in a way even he couldn't explain, and a man like him never left unexplained things alone. He had his people quietly look into her, and within 2 days, a thin file was placed on his desk, beginning with the name Della Whitlock, and quickly leading him to another name that made him pause, the name of her late husband, Eli Whitlock. The more Rowan read, the sharper his eyes became, because Eli hadn't been an ordinary man, despite the humble appearance of a poor, working-class family. He had once been a forensic accountant, the kind of man hired to follow dirty money and peel apart the most carefully hidden layers of disguise inside financial records. And what sent a cold sensation crawling up Rowan's neck was that the last company Eli had worked for was one of the front companies sitting dangerously close to the financial machinery of Rowan's own organization. A forensic accountant who knew how to read numbers other people couldn't see, working for a company connected to his empire, then suddenly dead in a car accident ruled to have been caused by slick rain-soaked roads only 3 months earlier, right around the time money inside Rowan's organization had begun to disappear in mysterious ways. For a man who had spent his whole life surviving by refusing to believe in coincidence, that many details lined up together no longer looked accidental. They were a shape, slowly coming into view. And then his instinct returned to the dog, the creature that Widow would rather starve than let go, the creature his gut told him wasn't simply a keepsake from a dead husband. He didn't yet know exactly what he was looking for, but he knew every road was leading back toward that woman and the animal in her arms, and to get close to what he needed, he would first have to get close to her. A few days later, a luxury car pulled up in front of Della's small house in the late afternoon, and when she opened the door, she found the very man who had placed that black business card on top of the money standing there, calm as though he belonged everywhere he set foot. Della immediately planted herself across the doorway, one hand gripping the door as if she were ready to slam it shut, and asked him how he knew where she lived and what he had come there for. Rowan didn't seem offended by her guardedness at all. He only said he knew about the debt and about the 7-day deadline tightening around her house, and that he could make all of it disappear with a single phone call. He said he could pay off the debt, lift the foreclosure order, and let her keep this home without having to sell anything she loved. Della listened with her heart pounding, because that was exactly what she had longed for, with desperate hunger for months. But precisely because it sounded so beautiful, she was even more afraid to believe it, and she asked him bluntly what he wanted in return, because she had learned that nobody in this world gave anything for nothing, especially not a powerful man the whole city feared. Rowan looked at her for a moment, And instead of speaking the truth churning inside his head about her dead husband and those deadly numbers, he answered in a smooth voice that he was simply a man who didn't like seeing a home fall into the hands of banks, and that she could consider it help with no strings attached. It was a lie wrapped with care. And deep inside Rowan, something gave a faint ache as he used this woman's desperation to get closer to the thing he was hunting. But he smothered that feeling immediately, the way he always did. Della stood there for a long time, torn between the suspicion screaming inside her and the brutal reality that she had only a few days left before she lost everything. And at last, in a voice so small it nearly dissolved into the air, she asked him what she would have to do if she agreed. Rowan's answer was so simple that it only left Della more confused. He said she didn't have to do anything at all except let him handle the debt. And just as he had promised, only a few days later, the threatening letter from Northridge Bank was replaced by another cold notice, confirming that the debt had been paid in full, and the foreclosure process had been cancelled. Della held that paper in her hands for a very long time, not knowing whether she should cry or be afraid, because Eli's home had been saved. But the true price of it still hung over her like an unanswered question. In the days that followed, Rowan occasionally came by, sometimes with the excuse of checking paperwork, sometimes for no clear reason at all, and Della slowly began to notice something strange about this man that she couldn't quite name. The whole city trembled before him. The people she had heard mention the name Vance always lowered their voices and glanced around as though afraid of being overheard. And yet when he sat in her poor little kitchen, drinking the cheap coffee she made in her old machine, he looked more like a lonely man than a terrifying crime lord. And Della, perhaps because she had already passed through so much loss that there weren't many things left for her to fear, treated him not the way people treated a powerful man, but the way someone treated an ordinary human being. She didn't shrink before him, didn't avoid his eyes. She poured him more coffee without asking permission, grumbled when he put his dirty shoes on the old rug, and once she even told him bluntly that he should eat something decent, instead of walking around with a face that looked as if he hadn't slept in days. Those small things were things no one in Rowan's world had ever dared to do with him, and it was precisely that naked, ordinary tenderness that touched something in him he had thought had died long ago. One evening, while Bruno lay curled beneath the table and the rain began falling again outside the window, Della asked him why a man who had everything looked as though he had nothing at all. And in that rare moment, Rowan allowed a piece of truth to show, a truth he hadn't spoken to anyone in many years. He told her, in an even voice as though he were speaking about someone else's life, that he had once had a wife, that she had once carried a child who never had the chance to be born, and that both of them had been stolen from him in one night by people who wanted to punish him for the things he had done. He didn't give her the details. He didn't seek her pity. He only said that from then on, he had understood one thing, that anything he allowed himself to love would become a weakness others could aim at. So he had chosen not to love anything anymore. Della fell silent as she listened. And instead of offering empty words of comfort, she only said softly that she was sorry, that she understood what it felt like to live in a house where the person you loved was no longer there, and that grief like that never truly went away. People only learned how to carry it with them. A strange silence settled over the kitchen. Not a heavy silence, but the silence of two wounded people who had accidentally recognized each other. And for the first time in a very long while, Rowan felt something warm slip through the ice he had built around his heart. He quickly stood and said goodbye, as though that warmth itself frightened him. But when he stepped out into the rain, he realized he was caught in a contradiction more dangerous than anything he had ever faced, because the woman he had approached for a dark purpose was slowly becoming the only person who made him want to be a better man. And Della, standing by the window as she watched the lights of his car disappear into the rain, was just as confused to realize that beneath all the doubts she still held about him, something new and tempting had begun to glow faintly inside her, something she didn't want to admit, but couldn't put out. That dangerous warmth didn't make Rowan careless. On the contrary, it drove him to dig even deeper into Della's situation, because one part of him wanted to understand this woman fully, while another part, the cold, rational part that had kept him alive for so many years, still couldn't stop suspecting that something about her misery wasn't entirely natural. He had his people trace the entire file on the house debt, every letter, every figure, every date. And the more he turned through those papers, the more clearly he saw that something didn't fit the normal logic of a foreclosure. The loan Della and her husband had taken out had never been large enough to lead to a seizure that quickly. The penalties and interest had been stacked on top of one another in an unusual way. Every request she had made for an extension had been denied for vague reasons, when a debtor like her, someone still willing to pay in installments, should have been given a chance. Some invisible hand had deliberately tightened the rope around this woman's neck. And when Rowan followed the approval signatures on the most important documents, they all led back to a single name at Northridge Bank, a vice president named Theodore Brandt, 51 years old, a face Rowan had seen flicker through the gray dealings of this city before. Brandt wasn't a decent bank employee who had accidentally made a widow suffer. He was a link in the underworld Rowan knew too well, and the fact that he had personally accelerated the foreclosure on Della's house couldn't be a coincidence. When Rowan placed that piece into the picture slowly taking shape, a cold realization moved through him. The desperate poverty that had driven Della to the point of selling her dog wasn't some random tragedy of fate. It was a trap, set with intention. Someone had wanted to force her into a corner, wanted her to let go of everything she owned, wanted to push her so far that she would even sell the last thing of value left in her house. And Rowan understood that no one built a trap that elaborate for an old house that wasn't worth very much money. They wanted something else, something inside that house or in that woman's possession, something she didn't even know she was holding. And by forcing her to willingly sell everything off, whoever stood behind it could take what they needed without leaving behind the marks of a robbery. The thought made the blood in Rowan's veins seem to freeze, because it connected directly to the money being siphoned out of his organization, to the staged death of Eli Whitlock, to the black dog his instincts had fixed on from the very first second. Everything was tightening into a single circle, and at the center of that circle stood an innocent woman being hunted without even knowing it. Rowan's suspicion was confirmed at once when his people reported that strangers had been regularly lurking around Della's house. A car parked at the end of the street for hours at a time with no reason to be there. A man sitting in the cafe across from where she worked, watching her through the glass. Della was being followed. Her every step was being recorded by someone, and that meant whoever had set the trap still hadn't gotten what they wanted. They were still waiting, still watching with patience. Rowan stood silently by the window of his office, staring out at the Black River, and for the first time in many years, he felt a foreign emotion mixed from cold anger and a worry he didn't want to admit, because protecting Della was no longer merely a move in his investigation. He knew he had to find whatever the enemy was craving before they had the chance to act, and he knew the answer was very close. So close that it was still sleeping every night at the foot of that woman's bed. The opportunity came one afternoon when Rowan stopped by Della's house and she was busy in the kitchen, leaving Bruno stretched out on the living room floor at his feet, and as Rowan reached down to stroke the animal out of habit, his fingers brushed against the leather collar around its neck and instantly went still. It looked like a specially designed adjustable collar, thick and sturdy, which Eli had bought to expand as the puppy grew, ensuring it never had to be replaced. But Rowan's hand, trained by years of feeling his way through hundreds of disguises, sensed something the naked eye couldn't see, an unusual thickness in the clasp, a ridge harder than the leather around it, something hidden inside. He glanced toward the kitchen to make sure Della was still occupied, then carefully removed the collar, ran his fingers along the stitching until he found an almost invisible opening, and when he gently separated that layer of leather, a small object slid into his palm, a thin, flat data drive no larger than a fingernail, sewn away so skillfully that no one could have suspected it was there unless they already knew to look. Rowan's heart seemed to slow for a beat, because he understood at once that this was the thing an entire elaborate conspiracy had been built to seize, the thing someone was willing to drive an innocent woman to the edge for, just to force her to sell it with her own hands, without ever knowing what she was giving away. He quietly fastened Bruno's collar back exactly as it had been, said goodbye to Della earlier than usual, and took the object straight to the safest place he owned. Before leaving, Rowan slipped a blank decoy drive of identical weight back into the hidden lining of the collar, ensuring that anyone who searched the dog would believe the secret was still safe. That night, alone in a dark room where only the cold glow of the screen washed across his face, Rowan and his most trusted technician broke through the layers of encryption built to protect whatever was inside, and when the final files opened before them, even a man as hardened as he was fell silent. Inside the drive was an entire archive of data, arranged with painstaking care by the hand of a forensic accountant. Every spreadsheet, every map of money flow, every transaction traced and peeled back to its source, exposing a massive money laundering network that had been slipping through the very front companies and banks inside Rowan's empire for years. Eli Whitlock had done the work he was best at. He had quietly recorded everything, had built a complete indictment powerful enough to sink an entire organization. And the more Rowan read, the more he realized an even colder truth, that the dirty money hadn't been flowing toward him the way he had always believed. It had been siphoned off behind his back with exquisite precision, redirected through channels that only someone who knew the internal machinery down to its smallest detail could have created. And when Rowan followed the final thread back to the man at the top, the name that appeared on the screen made his hand clench tight. It was Garrett Doyle, 44 years old, the man who had stood beside him for nearly 10 years, the man Rowan had once trusted with his most important secrets, the right hand he hadn't once considered while hunting for the traitor. It was Garrett who had quietly built a shadow empire inside Rowan's empire, who had bled the organization drop by drop for all those years. And when Eli Whitlock accidentally found his trail through his accounting work, Garrett had eliminated him cleanly and disguised it as a car accident on a rainy night. The last pieces finally locked into place, forming a cruel and unmistakable picture. And Rowan understood that Eli, before he died, must have sensed he was being hunted, so he had hidden all the evidence in the last place anyone would ever expect, inside the collar of the dog he had given his wife, leaving it lying silent in plain sight of the enemy for 3 agonizing months. The woman, sleeping not far away, still had no idea that she had been carrying, on that small living creature, a bomb powerful enough to shake the entire city. And Rowan, standing motionless in the dark with the terrible truth now exposed, knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same again. In the days after the night of that discovery, Rowan Vance lived in a state he had never known before, a slow, smoldering conflict that gnawed at him from the inside every time he closed his eyes. The truth he had unearthed didn't only expose the traitor inside his organization, it also placed a burden of guilt on his shoulders that he had no way to cast off, because the man who had been killed to keep him silent, the husband Della mourned every night, the man who had left behind the dog and the promise and the house she was risking her whole life to keep, that man had died at the hands of the very organization that bore Rowan's name. Even though Garrett had been the one who acted directly, even though everything had happened behind Rowan's back and beyond his control, Rowan still couldn't lie to himself and pretend he was innocent, because the empire he had built, the underworld he ruled, had been the place that gave birth to the knife that cut Eli Whitlock's life short and pushed his young wife into hell. Every time he looked into Della's eyes, every time she poured him a cup of cheap coffee and grumbled about the mud on his shoes, every time she smiled that rare, fragile smile in the middle of so much suffering, he felt the sharp ache of a man standing before someone he had wronged in a way she didn't even know. He, a man who had grown used to ordering death without blinking, a man who had buried mercy a very long time ago, was now being tormented into sleeplessness by an old emotion he had thought dead. And what frightened him most wasn't the guilt, but the realization of just how deeply he had come to care about that woman. Rowan knew he should have told her everything, should have placed the truth on the table and let her decide for herself. But every time that thought rose in his mind, he stepped back from it, partly because he feared that the moment she learned his organization had killed her husband would also be the moment she looked at him with disgust and turned away forever, and partly because he knew the more people knew about that drive, the more danger Della would be in. So he chose silence and quietly built an invisible shield around her. He sent his most absolutely loyal men to watch over her house from a distance. He arranged for every step she took to be followed and protected by someone she never noticed. He silently removed Garrett's watchers from her neighborhood under carefully crafted pretexts, so the enemy wouldn't be alerted. He buried the truth about the drive, not revealing to anyone that the evidence was already in his hands, because he understood that the only card that allowed him to stay one step ahead of Garrett was the fact that the traitor still believed the thing he was hunting remained somewhere beyond his reach. But Garrett Doyle wasn't an easy man to deceive, and after standing beside Rowan for 10 years, he had learned how to read the man down to the smallest change. He began to notice that something was different about his boss. Meetings where Rowan suddenly became more guarded, orders moving men around without Garrett being told the reason, the times Rowan disappeared from the office at unusual hours, with no one able to explain where he had gone. Garrett was suspicious by nature, and that suspicion now turned directly toward the man he had been betraying all this time, because a man hiding his own guilt begins to see betrayal in every shadow. He started having people look into Rowan's movements, tracing the places he went, And it didn't take very long for him to discover that the city's powerful crime lord had recently been appearing again and again in a place that had nothing to do with business, a shabby little house on the edge of the old neighborhood, home to the widow of the forensic accountant Garrett himself had eliminated. When that piece of information reached Garrett, a cold smile spread across his lips, because he understood at once that if Rowan cared about that woman so much, then she was the weakness he had been waiting for all along, and perhaps she was also the thread that would lead him to the thing he was still desperately searching for. While invisible forces were slowly tightening around her without her knowing it, Della spent a rare weekend afternoon doing the one thing she had put off for months, cleaning out Eli's small study, the room she had never had the courage to enter since the day he died. Everything inside remained exactly as it had been on the last day he had sat at that wooden desk. The pen he often used was still lying beside a stack of paper. His jacket still hung over the back of the chair, and the faint trace of his scent seemed to linger somewhere in the room, making her heart clench. She wiped each object through her tears, and when she pulled open the bottom drawer of the old filing cabinet, her hand touched something tucked deep inside, behind the false panel at the bottom of the drawer, a yellowed envelope with one word written on it, in Eli's heartbreakingly familiar handwriting, her name. Della sank down onto the floor, her hands trembling as she opened the envelope, and inside was a long handwritten letter he had hidden there at some point she couldn't know. A letter he had clearly written in the state of mind of a man who understood he might not have much time left. In those lines, Eli wrote that if she was reading these words, then he was probably no longer beside her, and he was sorry. Sorry he hadn't been able to keep his promise to stay with her always. Sorry for the burdens he knew she would have to carry in his place. He told her that through his work, he had accidentally uncovered something terrible, a great crime hidden behind numbers, something he couldn't simply close his eyes to, and that he had been faced with a brutal choice. He wrote that he had once considered arranging for the two of them to quietly leave the city, sell the house, change their names, go far away to a place where no one knew them, and begin again. That he had almost decided to do exactly that because all he wanted was to live in peace beside her. But then he couldn't, and he explained why, in words that made Della choke with grief, that he had thought of other families, other innocent people being drained and destroyed by that crime without ever knowing it, and that if he ran away to protect his own happiness, he would have to live the rest of his life knowing he had turned his back on them. He wrote that he couldn't spend all those years teaching her about kindness and then become a coward in front of her. That there are things a person must do even when he knows the price, and that he believed she, more than anyone in the world, would understand why he had chosen to stay. He ended the letter by telling her he loved her more than words could ever express, that he had left the truth in a safe place, and that one day it would find its own way into the light, and that she must never look for it, never get involved, only keep living and stay strong, because that would be enough to let him rest in peace. Della pressed the letter to her chest and sobbed in the silent room, crying for the husband she now understood had sacrificed his life not because of carelessness or misfortune as she had always believed, but because he had chosen to stand on the side of what was right until his final breath. Her respect for Eli rose inside her greater than ever before, but with it came a new conflict she hadn't expected. Because while her heart was filled with the image of her noble dead husband, she still couldn't deny that over these past weeks, another man had slipped into the emptiest corners of her heart. She felt guilty for having feelings for Rowan Vance at the very moment she had discovered the sacred sacrifice Eli had made, felt as though she were betraying the memory of the man who was gone, and sitting there in the dusk with the letter in her hands, Della no longer knew whether her heart should belong to the past, or whether she should allow herself to step toward a future she still didn't dare to name. While Della was still submerged in her own inner conflict, Garrett Doyle decided he wouldn't wait any longer, because the suspicion inside him had hardened into a cold conclusion that this woman was the key to the thing he needed, and also Rowan's fatal weakness, and dealing with her would solve both problems at once. He didn't show his own face. Instead, he sent 2 trusted men to Della's small house late at night, when the whole neighborhood had sunk into sleep, and a fine rain was falling just heavily enough to cover every sound. That night, Della tossed and turned for a long time, unable to sleep. Eli's letter still tucked beneath her pillow, while his words kept returning again and again through her mind without mercy, until exhaustion finally pulled her under. Bruno lay at the foot of the bed as he did every night, but the animal was no longer the tiny puppy he had once been. In only a few months, he had grown into a large dog with a powerful chest and a guarding instinct buried deep in the blood of his breed. And in the darkness of that night, while human ears heard nothing, his ears had already lifted and gone still. When two dark figures silently pried open the back door latch and slipped into the house, Bruno sprang up without a second of hesitation, and his barking tore through the night so violently that Della jolted awake in terror, not yet understanding what was happening before she heard the heavy footsteps and the crash of furniture breaking downstairs. The dog shot down the stairs like a black arrow, placing himself between the two strangers and the path leading up to Della's bedroom, growling with the full weight of a creature protecting the most precious thing in his life. And when one of the men tried to rush upward, Bruno lunged and clamped his teeth into the man's arm, making him scream in pain and stagger backward. Della trembled in the corner of the upstairs room, her hand fumbling for the phone in the dark. And in that moment of absolute terror, instinct pushed her finger to dial the only number she believed might save her, the number on the black business card she had kept. Downstairs, the two men tried to overpower the dog as he hurled himself at them again and again in a frenzy. But Bruno didn't back down, even when he was struck, even when he was kicked. He stubbornly held his ground between them and the staircase, growling and biting with the absolute loyalty Eli had spoken of years ago, when he said Bruno would watch over her when he couldn't be beside her anymore. The noise and the savage barking made lights switch on in several neighboring houses, and the two men, who had been ordered to act quickly and quietly, began to lose their composure when they realized everything was slipping out of control. Just as one of them pulled out something that flashed under the streetlight spilling through the window, the screech of brakes sounded violently outside, and the front door was kicked open as Rowan's men burst in, the men who had been stationed nearby under his orders rushing to the house the instant Della's call connected. In the chaos, the two attackers understood that their time had run out, and instead of risking their lives, they fled through the back door, vanishing into the rainy night before they could be captured, leaving behind a shattered house and a dog standing breathless in the middle of the living room, with blood spreading across his black fur. Della stumbled down the stairs when it was over, and when she saw Bruno wounded but alive, still lifting his head and weakly wagging his tail toward her, she collapsed to her knees and wrapped her arms around the animal, sobbing uncontrollably, from fear and from gratitude toward the creature that had risked his life to protect her. She didn't understand why anyone would want to hurt her. She didn't understand what was truly happening around her life. But there, in the ruined house with the rain falling beyond the porch, a vague fear began to whisper to her that all of this was somehow connected to the truth Eli had tried to keep hidden, and that the quiet life of suffering she had known was about to change forever. Rowan arrived only a few minutes after his men had driven back the two attackers, and when he stepped through the door that had been kicked open and saw Della kneeling in the middle of the wrecked room, clutching the blood-covered dog in her arms, something in his chest tightened in a way he had long forgotten he was still capable of feeling. He knelt beside her, checking to see whether she was hurt, his voice losing its usual calm for the first time. And Della lifted her tear-reddened eyes to him, shaken by panic and gratitude, clinging to his presence as though it were the last piece of driftwood in the middle of a storm. But it was in that fragile moment, when she trembled and asked him why anyone would want to kill her, why they had broken into her house in the middle of the night, that Rowan understood he had reached the threshold where he couldn't stay silent any longer. He looked into the tear-soaked face of the woman who had slipped into his hardened heart, and he knew that if he hid the truth from her for even one more day, he wouldn't only be placing her in danger, he would also be turning himself into the kind of coward he despised. And so, in a deep, heavy voice, Rowan began to tell her the truth, one word at a time, each one like a blade he was driving into himself. He told her that Eli's death hadn't been an accident, that her husband had been murdered because he had uncovered a criminal network, and that the people who had killed him, the people who had broken into her house tonight, all came from the very organization that he, Rune Vance, led. Della froze. The hand that had been stroking Bruno suddenly went rigid, and she stared at him as though she couldn't believe what she had just heard, asking again and again what he was saying, begging him to tell her she had misunderstood. But Rowan didn't look away. He let her look straight into his eyes, and said clearly that his organization was the place that had given birth to the man who killed her husband, that he had known this truth for days and had still kept silent, that even his first appearance in her life hadn't been as pure as she had believed. For a moment, the room sank into a horrifying silence. Then Della's face slowly changed, the gratitude and desperate clinging from moments before shattering and giving way to something even more frightening than panic: betrayal. She sprang to her feet, and backed away from him as though retreating from something poisonous. And the tears now spilling down her face weren't from fear, but from a pain torn open at the deepest place inside her. She screamed and asked whether all of it had only been an act, whether his kindness, his visits, the cups of coffee, the warmth she had been foolish enough to trust, had all been just a way for him to use a desperate widow to get what he wanted. She said she had let him step into Eli's house, had let him sit at Eli's table, had allowed her heart to feel something for the very man who belonged to the world that had stolen her husband's life, and the thought made her sick with disgust at herself. Rowan tried to say that what he felt for her was real, that he hadn't known about Eli's death when he first came to her. But every word he spoke fell into emptiness, because to Della in that moment, no explanation meant anything anymore. Nothing could wash away the truth that the man she had begun to care for had come from the very source of her life's tragedy. Trembling, she told him to get out of her house and never come back, her voice breaking between sobs, and when Rowan still stood there motionless, pain written clearly across the face that had always been so cold, she gathered Bruno into her arms herself and walked out into the night, fleeing the house that no longer felt safe, leaving behind the most powerful man in the city standing alone amid the wreckage, utterly powerless for the first time in his life, before the only thing he truly wanted to keep. After the night Della left with the dog, Rowan returned to the vast, empty room on the top floor of his building and sat there alone in the dark for hours. No liquor, no lights, only the black river beyond the glass and the echo of the words Della had thrown in his face. For the first time in many years, the man who had grown used to controlling an entire empire with absolute coldness was forced to face himself with nowhere left to hide, and what he saw in that invisible mirror filled him with disgust. All his life, he had told himself he was only a practical man in a brutal world, that the crimes he had committed were simply the necessary price of survival, but Eli Whitlock's death and the shattered face of his wife had stripped that reasoning down to what it had always been, a hollow excuse for a life built on the blood of innocent people. He realized that the empire he had been so proud to build from nothing had, in truth, been rotting from the inside for a very long time, that it had not only sheltered a traitor like Garrett, but that it itself, from its very foundation, had been a machine that crushed people like Della and Eli, and that if he continued to protect it, he would be no different from the man who had killed her husband. In the absolute loneliness of that night, something inside Rowan Vance broke open, and something else was born, because he understood that destroying Garrett alone wouldn't be enough. That would only be using violence to wash away violence, cutting off one head so the rotten body could grow another, and it would never bring justice back to Eli or peace back to Della. He understood that to truly atone for his sins, he had to do the one thing he had never imagined doing in all his life. He had to tear down with his own hands the very empire that had defined him, had to drag it out of the darkness and expose it beneath the light, even if doing so meant burying himself along with it. That decision didn't come to him in a moment of impulse. It grew inside him throughout the night like a cold but steady light, and by the time dawn broke beyond the window, he knew exactly what he had to do. He went to Silas Kerrigan, the 58-year-old advisor who had stood beside him from the earliest days, the only person in his world he could still trust completely, and he told him the whole truth about the drive, about Garrett, about Eli, about everything. Silas listened in silence for a long time, his aging face marked by deep lines of thought. Then he said he had followed Rowan all his life and would walk with him to the end of this road, wherever that road might lead them. With Silas's help, Rowan did something anyone in the underworld would have considered impossible. He quietly found a way to make contact with a federal prosecutor known for being both hard-edged and incorruptible, a woman who had spent years trying to dismantle criminal networks like his and had never been able to reach their core. He prepared to hand over not only the evidence of Garrett's money laundering network, but also the evidence that could sink Rowan himself, because he understood that real atonement couldn't come with leaving himself an escape route. As he sat down to prepare for the fateful meeting that would change everything, Rowan knew he was trading away power, freedom, and perhaps even his life, but for the first time since the night he had lost his wife and child many years before, he felt he was doing something right, and even if Della never forgave him, he still wanted to leave her a world where the man who had killed her husband would pay, and where she could live without fear anymore. But Garrett Doyle didn't sit still and wait for fate to come crashing down on him. And with the sharp instincts of a man who had spent his whole life surviving through betrayal, he sensed that Rowan was preparing a major move against him, even though he didn't yet know exactly what it was. He decided to strike first, and he aimed straight at the only weakness Rowan had exposed. The woman the cold-blooded crime lord had risked his entire position to protect. Garrett had his men follow Della for days after the night she fled her own house. And one afternoon, as she was on her way home from work, they cut her off, subdued both her and the dog that was growling and fighting back, then took her to an abandoned warehouse buried deep in the docks controlled by the organization itself, a dark place heavy with the smell of sea salt and machine oil, where any cry for help would be swallowed by the night. From there, Garrett called Rowan, his voice smug with triumph, saying he had the woman and the dog, but since the drive inside the collar was heavily encrypted, if Rowan wanted her to stay alive, he had to bring the decryption key himself. Alone, no police, no federal agents, no clever little tricks. Rowan knew very well that it was a trap, that Garrett never had any intention of letting either him or Della walk out of that dock alive, but he also knew that every passing second was another second with Della's life hanging by a thread, so he couldn't hesitate. He, Silas Kerrigan, and a small group of his most loyal men laid out a plan to approach the warehouse under cover of night, with Rowan meant to distract Garrett at the main entrance, while Silas led the others around to the rear, secretly getting Della out before anything had the chance to turn bloody. But what neither Rowan nor Silas had foreseen was that Garrett had already predicted every step they would take, because after 10 years at Rowan's side, he had learned by heart the way this man thought and acted in desperate situations. When Silas's group quietly moved toward the rear entrance of the warehouse, they had no idea Garrett had already placed men in ambush in the darkness, and the instant they neared the door, a burst of gunfire tore the silence apart, turning their carefully planned rescue into a bloody chaos within seconds. Rowan's men walked straight into the trap, their formation shattered, and in the storm of bullets, Silas Kerrigan was hit and went down, blood spreading across the cold concrete, the old advisor who had followed Rowan all his life now lying motionless outside the door he hadn't managed to open. Inside, Rowan heard the gunshots and understood at once that everything had fallen apart, that Garrett had been one step ahead of him, and when he rushed forward, he saw only his own men retreating in chaos, while Silas lay collapsed on the ground. Garrett emerged from the darkness with a faint smile on his lips and a gun aimed straight at him, saying with victory in his voice that he had known Rowan would never come alone, that Rowan's faith in other people was exactly what had gotten them killed, and that now the great crime lord of Brightmoor had no cards left in his hand. Della was tied up in a corner of the warehouse, her mouth covered, her eyes wide with terror as she watched the scene before her, and when her gaze met Rowan's in that moment of hopelessness, all the anger and resentment inside her suddenly gave way to one naked fear, the fear that both of them were about to die in this place. Rowan stood there in the dark warehouse, his loyal advisor fallen outside, his plan reduced to smoke, his enemy holding every advantage, and the woman he loved pressed close to death, trapped for the first time in his life at the end of the road with no escape appearing before him. In that moment when there seemed to be no way out, there was one thing Garrett Doyle, in the height of his triumph, had forgotten to account for, and that was the dog. While subduing Della and bringing her to the warehouse, his men hadn't paid much attention to Bruno. They had only shut the animal away for the moment in a hidden corner behind stacks of crates, thinking that even a large dog couldn't do anything inside a warehouse full of guns. But they hadn't understood the nature of the breed curled in that darkness. They hadn't understood that all this time Bruno's ears had been following every sound, that his eyes had remained locked on the woman tied up before him, and that when the gunfire erupted and the scent of blood spread through the air, it awakened every guarding instinct buried deep in his veins. Just as Garrett was pointing his gun at Rowan and delivering his final arrogant words, a huge black shadow burst from behind the crates as fast as lightning, and before anyone had time to react, Bruno had lunged and clamped his jaws around Garrett's gun arm, yanking his whole body sideways, causing the shot to go wild and the gun to fly from his hand and skid across the concrete floor. Garrett screamed in pain and panic as he tried to tear free from the dog holding him fast, and that sudden chaos was the only opening Rowan needed. He charged forward without a second of hesitation, using the full weight and decisive force of a man with nothing left to lose, knocking Garrett to the floor and overpowering him after a violent struggle, while the rest of Rowan's men seized that chance to fight back and subdue Garrett's disoriented men. When everything settled, Garrett lay there at Rowan's feet, unarmed, wounded, and helpless, the traitor who had held every advantage now completely in the hands of the man he had betrayed. Rowan picked up the gun, and for one long, endless moment, He stood looking down at the face of the man who had bled his organization dry, murdered Eli Whitlock, pushed Della into hell, and just shot down his loyal advisor outside. Every fiber of the old self inside him screamed for him to pull the trigger, to finish Garrett right there. According to the ruthless underworld law, Rowan had lived by his whole life, and Garrett, seeing the gun in his hand, curled his mouth in defiance and told him to do it, that this was who Rowan Vance really was. But Rowan stood still, and in that threshold moment, he thought of Eli, the man who had chosen to stay and protect innocent people instead of running away. He thought of Della and the look in her eyes, when she had called him a man who belonged to the world that killed her husband. He thought of the decision he had reached in that lonely night high above the city, that violence could never wash violence clean. And then, to everyone's astonishment, he slowly lowered the gun, stepped back, and told Garrett that killing him would be too easy and too merciful, that he wouldn't die like some gangster, but would live to face every one of his crimes before the law, so the whole city could watch him stripped bare and judged. He ordered Garrett tied up instead of executed, then knelt beside Silas, who was still barely breathing outside the door, and called for an ambulance at once. At the same time, just as he had secretly prepared, he notified the federal prosecutor of the warehouse's exact location and all the evidence. When sirens tore through the night along the docks, and blue and red lights swept across the stained walls, Rowan untied Della with trembling hands, and for the first time, she saw that in the eyes of the man once known as the coldest in the city, there was no longer ice, but something that had been redeemed. What happened after that night at the docks shook the entire city of Brightmoor in a way no one could have foreseen. The full archive of data Eli Whitlock had quietly and painstakingly gathered, together with the evidence Rowan himself voluntarily handed over, was placed in the hands of the federal prosecutor, and it was so complete and so detailed that no expensive attorney could deny it. The money laundering network Garrett Doyle had secretly operated for years was dragged into the light, setting off the collapse of an entire underworld network that had once seemed untouchable. Garrett was indicted on a long list of serious charges, from money laundering and extortion to murder. And this time, there was no power or money left that could save him from the defendant's chair. The man who had sat in the dark pulling strings over so many lives now had to sit before a court and face every crime he had committed. Theodore Brandt, the bank vice president who had deliberately set the foreclosure trap around Della's neck and around the necks of many other families, was also dragged into the light when the dirty money was traced all the way back to his signatures, and he was charged for his role as a financial link in the entire conspiracy. As the investigation widened, people discovered that Della hadn't been the only victim, that many other families had also been forced by this same network into losing their homes illegally, honest people crushed simply to serve the greed of a small handful of powerful men. Thanks to the evidence that had been uncovered, the authorities began the process of review and restitution, and one by one, homes that had been wrongfully seized were returned to their former owners, fraudulently inflated debts were erased, and justice was brought to families who had suffered in silence and desperation, without knowing whom to turn to. That was exactly what Eli had sacrificed his life to protect. It was the reason he had chosen to stay instead of running away, and now his final wish had come true, even though he was no longer there to see it with his own eyes. As for Rowan Vance, the road ahead wasn't some miraculous escape, and he had never asked for one. He had voluntarily handed over even the evidence that could incriminate him, had admitted his role in the underworld he had once ruled, and he understood that real atonement had to come with bearing the consequences. He cooperated fully with the federal investigation, providing information that helped dismantle links in the network law enforcement had been chasing unsuccessfully for years. And that rare cooperation, along with the fact that he was the one who brought the entire conspiracy into the light and saved lives, was taken into account by the court when it decided his fate. Rowan didn't escape the punishment of the law. He had to face sentences for his past. But because of his honesty and his decisive contributions to solving the case, the sentence he received was reduced significantly compared with what a man in his position would otherwise have been given. It was a fair ending, neither romanticized nor unrealistic. A man who had done many wrong things had to pay for them, but he was also given a chance to begin again, because he had proven that he truly wanted to change. Meanwhile, Della's small house, the home Eli had poured his whole life into building and she had risked everything to keep, finally and truly belonged to her in full and lawful measure, the unjust debt erased completely once the truth about the financial trap was exposed. For the first time after months of living in fear and loss, Della could stand inside her own home without hearing fate counting down around her. And though her heart was still tangled with 100 unresolved feelings, she knew the darkest chapter of her life had finally come to an end. Silas Kerrigan miraculously survived the shooting, and after spending several months in the hospital, the loyal advisor finally made a full recovery. Many months had passed since that night at the docks, and the bitter winter of that year had given way to warm afternoons when sunlight spilled gold across the small street where Della lived. Her house was no longer a silent place buried under debt collection letters and fear, but had become a true home again, with windows always open to welcome the breeze and a backyard where Bruno could run freely to his heart's content. The tiny puppy Eli had brought home not so long ago had now become a large and majestic Neapolitan Mastiff, his sleek black coat shining and his steady stance carrying the dignified presence of a creature born to protect. Yet his brown eyes were still as gentle as they had been on the first day whenever he looked up at Della, and every night he still kept watch at the foot of her bed, just as her late husband had entrusted him to do when he promised that Bruno would always look after her. Della had learned how to keep living, not by forgetting Eli, but by carrying his love and his lessons with her through every day. And the letter he had left behind, the noble choice he had made when he decided to stand on the side of innocent people, became the guiding light that helped her understand something important about the human heart. She had seen with her own eyes a man who had seemed beyond saving choose to turn his back on an entire empire of darkness in order to stand with what was right, and though the wound inside her heart needed a very long time to heal, she slowly came to understand that holding on to hatred forever couldn't bring back what had been lost, while forgiveness could open a new door. Della visited Rowan, at first only in short and hesitant visits, then more and more often, and through those conversations she realized that the man before her was no longer the cold crime lord he had once been, but a person honestly facing his past and trying to atone for it day by day. She didn't forgive him easily, and he never asked her to, but between two people who had both been deeply wounded, a quiet and enduring understanding began to grow, a feeling built on sincerity rather than illusion. When Rowan was finally allowed to return, after he had paid most of the price the law and his conscience demanded of him, the one waiting for him at the threshold was Della, with Bruno standing beside her, and in that moment, all three of them understood that they had walked through the darkness together to find a new beginning none of them had ever dared to dream of. The story of Della and Rowan reminds us that a person's dignity doesn't lie in whether they're rich or poor, powerful or powerless, but in the way they choose to treat others. That sincere kindness and respect can touch and awaken the goodness even inside a heart that seems to have turned to stone, and that no one, no matter how far they've lost their way, is completely undeserving of a second chance to rebuild their life. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so that together we can spread meaningful stories and bring you more engaging videos every day. How do you feel about the journey of Della, Rowan, and Bruno the dog? And what do you think this story reflects in real life around us, where sometimes kindness and respect can change an entire person? We truly look forward to hearing the deepest feelings from your heart, so please don't hesitate to leave a comment below the video and share your thoughts. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story until the very final moment. And we also wish everyone watching this video good health, joyful days, and a peaceful heart. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next videos.
We have two brandies here now. I love it here already, Pam! Stop! Captain Wrecked? I've never been to Australia before. Is it true and real? Does it really look like Mad Max Fury Road? Yeah, in parts, yes. Shrimp heaven now! Yes. Oh, Cuba PD, 100%, yes. Only one wispy, that's true. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you so much. Food, thank you for the biddies. Dear, thank you. You guys, what's happening? Ugly crying, what the fuck? Thank you so much. That finish line is the last record. Oh my god. This is wholesome.